This is the painting we're going to be doing today. It's a fun spring subject and we're going to take it step by step, so something that might feel overwhelming becomes broken down and easy to follow. I hope you enjoy the lesson. Let's begin. These are the materials I'll be using today. They're pretty standard for all of my lessons. If you'd like, you can pause the video and refer to the video description to gather your supplies. These are the paint colors I will be using for today's painting. You're welcome to pause the video and refer to the video description for these exact colors: sap green, cadmium yellow, permanent rose, purple lake, cerulean blue, and Payne's gray. Also in the video description is a line drawing that you can download and print from home. I want you to print the flower line drawing at the scale you plan on painting it. If you have graphite transfer paper, you can position it underneath your line drawing. Otherwise, if you don't, just use a pencil at home and apply graphite directly behind your printed line drawing, and then position it on top of your watercolor paper so that that graphite is touching the surface of your watercolor paper. Tape it in position so it does not shift, and then grab a ballpoint pen and begin tracing the line drawing. With just the pressure of your pen, you should be able to get your lines to transfer. If they're coming out black, you're pressing too hard. You want just a nice soft gray. That way it doesn't show through all your finished paint. Once you're done with your line drawing, go ahead and remove the line drawing and set it aside. If you need to, you can pause this video while you do your line drawing. For these cherry blossoms, we are going to begin with the lightest colors on the petals first. So I'm just going to get some of my paint colors together. I'm going to use a number 10 round, and I'm going to allow my brush to hold as much water as it can hold to bring some over to a few areas of my palette. So I only need a puddle that's about the size of a nickel or a dime, nothing too large. Once I have water in a few areas of my paint palette, I'm going to begin mixing my paint colors. One of the colors I'm going to use is Permanent Rose, and I'm going to dissolve that into one of the puddles, and I'm going to drag my brush across the rim of the palette, and then I'm going to test out my paint color on a scrap piece of paper. If I'm happy with that paint color, then I can proceed to the next. I'm going to use Permanent Rose again, but this time I'm going to add a little bit of Purple Lake. I'm going to test out my color. That's not quite a big enough difference between my colors, so I'm going to add a little bit more Purple Lake. And I'm going for about a 50-50 mixture between the Permanent Rose and Purple Lake, and I just want a little bit of a darker value. So I'm happy with this color here. I'm now going to rinse my brush, and I'm going to go to the third color that I plan on mixing, which is going to include the Permanent Rose, but less amount this time, and I'm going to get the smallest amount of Payne's gray. I want kind of this watered down, soft pink gray color for in the shadows. So that's the right color, but it's far too dark, so I need to lighten it up. So I'm going to allow my brush to bring over some clean water. And I feel like that value is better. Okay, So before I begin, I'm going to take a look at the transfer lines. And since these petals are such a light color, I want to make sure none of those pencil lines are too dark or they're going to show through these soft values. So I'm just taking a kneaded eraser and I'm tapping just the outside edges of the first petal I plan on painting, which will be the top center on this particular flower. Now, before I begin painting my petals, I do need to make sure to mask the little yellow pollen ends in the center of my flower. That way these grays and pinks don't dull the yellows that I want to paint later. So I'm going to use a number 2 round, a small cup of water with some dish soap in it, and I'm going to coat the bristles of this small brush using that soapy water. This is going to help provide a layer of protection. I'm then going to grab some masking fluid, and I'm going to get a small amount of masking fluid on my brush, and I'm going to find just those little center pollen areas. And they don't have to be in the same exact location I have them. Just kind of spread them out. Because of the angle we're at, they should be more spread out towards the top because they're the ones that are further away, and because of our angle there will be more spacing. But the ones that are closer to us, we're at more of a side angle. So they're going to be a little more tightly packed in. So I'm just going to take a moment to add these small little dots. It's okay if they run into each other. That means they're just overlapping one another, and that's very natural. But notice how there's more spacing between them and the top, and they're more tightly packed towards the bottom. We're going to do this for each flower. After you've done one flower, rinse your brush in that soapy water to make sure that masking fluid doesn't have a chance to dry on your brush, and then repeat the process with your next flower. So there's usually one larger central pollen that is a little bit more of a focal point. And then the others are smaller in scale. I'm going to rinse the masking fluid out of my brush before I move on to the third flower. If you let your masking fluid dry on your brush, it will potentially ruin your brush, so just be cautious of that. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. I'm going to rinse the masking fluid out of my brush really well. And the optional addition with the masking fluid is to mask some of these forward stems that are going to these little pollen sections. However, for me personally, I find it difficult to apply masking fluid in a thin line using a brush. So for today, I'm going to choose to have some white paint on hand to use towards the very end. But if you don't have white paint, you can go ahead and just mask some of these forward stems using light pressure with your masking fluid. Otherwise, I believe that's really the only areas that need to be masked. So now, make sure your tools are completely clean and free of any masking fluid. You don't want your tools ruined. And then go a step further to rinse that soapy water out of your brush. Now the masking fluid on the first flower has dried, so I can begin painting the petals there. I'm going to use clean water to apply in this top center petal. And I don't want to apply so much water that I have just tons of puddles. That's going to make it very difficult to control where your paint goes. So there's a happy medium. You don't want it too dry, but you don't want it so wet that you have standing puddles. And I'm making sure to bring this water down past some of those little pollen areas. So I'm going to tip the paper so you can kind of see the sheen. Notice how the water has already begun to absorb into the fibers of the paper. That's that happy stage that we want. I'm going to use my number 6 round, and I'm going to start with the lighter pink that I had mixed up. And I'm just kind of taking my time to go around the outside edges of this petal using this really soft pink. And I'm doing my best to drag my brush along the edges, kind of tracing it to make sure I have this nice clean outside edge to my petal. I'm now going to rinse my brush and drag it across a sponge to remove the excess water from it. And with this mildly damp brush, I can now kind of feather the transition between my color and the clean water on this petal, just to create some softer transitions where it looks like a smoother gradient. Once I have kind of feathered those transitions and I'm happy with their appearance, I can now grab a little bit of that watered down gray purple, and notice how I'm dragging my brush across the rim of my palette. I'm removing that excess paint. I'm even going a step further and doing a light dab on a paper towel or sponge, just so I'm not taking too much paint over to my petal. Now on the right side of this petal, we have a little bit more shadow, so that's where I'm putting this watered down gray purple. Now I have a little bit of blooming texture on the edge. It doesn't bug me, but if it bugs you, you can rinse your brush and dry it off using that sponge or paper towel, and you can drag your brush across that edge just to kind of smooth that transition out. Now I have some gloss still on my petal, which means I have a little bit more working time. So if I want, I can use a number 2 round, just a nice small brush. And if I want, I can come in and try and establish some just subtle petal folds using my small brush. And I'm going to call that good for that petal. If I continue to fiddle while it's beginning to dry, then the results just aren't as soft and beautiful. So I'm going to give that petal space. Any additional details I need to add will have to be done on the second layer. Now I can't work the petals that are side by side because they're sharing an edge. So I'm going to jump to this forward petal. And before I add my clean water, I want to make sure to use my kneaded eraser to soften any dark pencil lines, especially on the outside edges of this petal. This just minimizes the chances of your pencil lines showing in your finished painting. So I'm coming in with some clean water, staying in the shape of that forward petal. And again, I'm not adding so much water that it's puddling. If I have puddles, I simply dry my brush on a sponge or paper towel and use my dry brush to soak up the excess water. But if I tip my paper, you can kind of see that I don't have any standing puddles and it's beginning to absorb into the paper. And that's that happy stage that we want. So I'm going to grab my number 6 round. I'm going to get the lighter pink. I'm dragging my brush across the rim of my palette so it's only semi-loaded. And I'm going to go across this back edge of the petal just to get this soft pink in. Now there is some soft pink at the forward front edge of this petal, but it is such a narrow shape that if I do it now, it's going to become too wide. So I'm not going to bother with that just yet. I'm going to rinse all the pink out of my brush and dab the sponge to remove the excess water. So I'm pretty much working with a clean, dry brush now. And I'm going to use this dry brush to come in and work that transition or gradient between the pink where it meets with the water. There's also some shadows from the center pollen. Those are, include a hard edge to them, so I'm going to establish those on the second pass. Right now, I just want to get some subtle color to the petal. And I'm going to get out while that dries. So now, because these two petals are still damp, I can't work any other area of that flower at this time. So I'm going to have to jump to the flower on the bottom left, making sure the masking fluid is completely dry before I proceed. I'm going to paint this upper left petal first, but I'm going to lighten my pencil lines using my kneaded eraser. I'm going to get some clean water. Don't be afraid to go right over top of the nearby petals because they do overlap one another. And don't be afraid to go right on top of that masking fluid. Bring that water to the center of your flower. Don't stop short just because of the pollen. So kind of imagine that petal coming to a point towards the center. Now double check the sheen of your water. Make sure that it is glossy but without puddles. I'm going to tilt my paper so you can kind of see where I've put my water. Okay. And before this begins to dry, I need to get some subtle color in there. So I'm using my number 6 round. I'm going to grab that lighter pink. I'm semi-loading it, so I'm dragging my brush across the rim of my palette to remove some of the excess paint. And I'm going to go along the outside edges as a starting point. When I'm up against the outside edges, I do try to slow down and drag my brush across that edge just to avoid little wobbles and bumps. If there are little wobbles and bumps, I just tell myself there was a ladybug or caterpillar on the petal. I don't really stress about it. All right, so I have some color along the outside edges. I'm now going to rinse the paint out of my brush, dry my brush off, and with a clean dry brush, I'm going to kind of feather that transition between the paint and the water so it looks like a more gradual gradient and it doesn't look like too quick of a transition. Now I still have a nice little sheen to this petal, so that lets me know visually that I have some working time yet. So I'm going to grab my number 2 round. I'm going to drag it across the rim so it's semi-loaded. And I'm just going to try and establish a few lines to indicate some petal texture. And now I'm going to let that petal dry. Any additional details will have to be done on the second pass. So I'm moving on to the next petal. I'm going to do this lower center petal, but before I do, I need to lighten those pencil lines. And I find it helpful to not lighten all pencil lines at the very beginning because sometimes that makes it difficult to see where you're at and you'll lose your place. So I find it helpful to kind of just work one area at a time. So now that my pencil lines are lightened, I'm going to get some clean water inside this petal. Now if there's any puddles, I dry my brush on a sponge or paper towel, and I soak up those puddles or excess water using my dry brush. Once I've thinned out the water, then I can begin adding some of that soft pink. Now this lower petal is a little bit more in shadow, so I will be adding some of that gray purple to this whole petal. So I'm going to start with that color first. And I'm just going to fill this petal in, going slow up on my edges. If I have any puddling paint, I can use a dry brush to soak up any puddling paint. But I'm going to grab some of that lighter pink now, and just along some of the edges, I'm going to add just a hint of some of that pink. Now I kind of like the texture that is being created by the two colors and where they meet, so I'm going to let that be instead of blending that away. And as long as there's no puddles and you're happy with your edges, then you just can step away and let that layer dry. Now I'm in the same position I am with the previous flower. I have wet edges, so I can't really work any areas nearby. So I am going to have to move on to the next flower. So I'm going to start with this upper large petal with my kneaded eraser. I'm going to lighten the pencil lines. I'm going to use some clean water to fill this petal. Going right over top of that pollen. Not worried about it at all. Making sure to bring that petal down to the center of the flower. I'm taking a moment to make sure that my petal is staying damp and there's no areas that are drying too quickly. And I make sure there's no puddles before I begin adding my paint color. This petal is also in shadow, so I need some of that watered down gray purple as a base color for this petal. but this one is going to have a little bit more of a softer center. So I'm only adding this gray purple to the outside edges, and then I'm going to feather it into the clean water that's at the center. Rotate your painting if that makes it easier to reach certain angles. I'm keeping mine stationary only for the sake of the video lesson. So I've gone around the outside edges, bringing that color down to the center of my flower. I'm going to rinse my brush, take the water out of my brush so it's clean and dry, and I'm just going to feather that soft gray purple into that center clean water. Now before that dries, I am going to get some of the soft pink. You know what? I'm going to go with the Purple Lake and pink mixture on this one. And I'm going to go along the outside edge. Now I can rinse my brush, dry it off, and I can kind of blend these colors if I choose. But if you like some of that beautiful texture that's created when you drop color into an existing color, you can leave some of that. It just adds interest to your painting. So don't feel like you have to blend it all away. I'm going to use my small #2 round, making sure it only has a small amount of paint in it. And I'm going to add just a little bit of petal texture here and there. And I'm going to let that petal dry. I'm now going to do this bottom left petal of this same flower, softening my pencil lines before I add my water. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. Making sure there's no puddles so you can kind of see the sheen. This petal also has some shadows, so I'm going to use that watered down gray purple to start. Right along this bottom half, I want that gray purple. Now I'm going to rinse the paint out of my brush, dry it off so I can use it to blend the transition between where that gray purple comes to the clean water. And I'm just going to make that transition a little bit more subtle and gradual. I'm now going to switch to my #2 round, I want to add some of that Purple Lake and pink mixture, making sure my brush isn't too loaded with too much paint, so I wipe away the excess. So this is just some of that purple and pink. I can add some petal texture if I want. I'm going to add a little bit of this pink to the inside. And I'm going to let this dry. So now in that time frame, the other petals from the first flower have since dried, so we can just continue this technique going back to where we started. So I'm going to work on the petal that's on the upper left of the first flower, using a kneaded eraser to lift those darker pencil lines. And if you find that you can't get your pencil lines as light, you can just use a micron pen at the end of your painting and trace your pencil line so it looks more like an illustration. Either way, it's going to be beautiful. So I'm filling in the petal with clean water. Now these petals overlap, so this is where we're going to be very gentle with our pressure. If I apply too much pressure, I run the risk of lifting the paint that is on this first petal that I painted. So when I bring my water over top of that petal, I'm going to want to do so with just feather light pressure and as minimal paint strokes as possible. So the first thing I'm doing is making sure that I have clean water in the rest of my petal first. Bringing that petal down to the center of the flower. Making sure there's no puddles. And then I'm going to use light pressure to put clean water right on top where the two overlap. So if you look where my water is, you can kind of see where they overlap there. I'm making sure that my water level is even. I don't have any puddles. And notice how I'm avoiding that area because I don't want to lift that color. So I'm now going to use that soft pink. I'm going to the left edge. Trying to take my time along my edges so they look nice and smooth. Now I have some puddling of paint, so I'm going to dry my brush on my sponge or paper towel, and I'm going to tap the surface of that puddle so my brush soaks up that excess paint, making it more even. Now using a clean, dry brush, I can blend some of where this pink meets the water in the center of my petal. I can also soak up any excess pink that might be a little heavy-handed. Trying to bring that water down to the center. If I want to, I can switch to my number 2 round and add some petal texture. So I'm using some of that gray purple making sure my brush isn't too overloaded. And I'm just doing one stroke and then pulling my brush away from the paper as I get towards the top. And I'm going to dab in some of this gray purple along the left edge because there is some shadow there. I'm just double checking my outside edges before I let it dry, smoothing out any bumps or wobbles that happened on accident. And I need to let that petal dry. So now I'm going to hop over to the petal on the right and repeat the same process. Starting with clean water. I accidentally had some of my water go on top of that forward petal, which I don't want. So I just dab with a paper towel to dry it. But there is going to be some overlap on the left edge of this petal. So I'm being very gentle with my pressure, going around that front petal. I'm going to use my number 6 round. I do want some of that gray purple for some shadows on this flower. So I'm going to start by going over the fold area. I want this gray purple to go around and behind that forward petal. And I'm going to rinse all the paint out of my brush, dry it off. I'm going to use my dry brush to kind of blend where that purple meets the wet water in the center of the petal, just to soften it. And then before I allow this to dry, I'm going to grab some of that soft pink, making sure my brush isn't too loaded with paint, so wiping away the excess paint. And I'm just kind of tracing that right edge. Sometimes I'll tap my brush to encourage it to release more of the pigment that it's holding on to. I'm going to drag some of those soft pinks through the center of that petal. And I'm going to let that dry. I have a little bit of that gray purple color creeping into that forward petal. It most likely won't show in the finished product, but I can press down firmly with the dry paper towel just to try and minimize the effect. Now I can't work on this far left petal because the one above is still damp, so I need to proceed down to flower 2 to keep working. Using my kneaded eraser to make sure my lines are softened. Coming in with some water, but using feather light texture when I go over top of the petal on the left. I'm going around the petal that is in the front, and I'm making sure there's no puddles. I'm going to grab that soft gray purple. Going around that petal below it. I'm going to rinse my brush, dry it off. Any puddling of paint I'm going to soak up using my dry brush by just tapping the top surface of the puddle. Now I'm going to get some of that purple lake and pink mixture, and on the left edge I'm going to add some of that color where the petals overlap. Rinse my brush, get all the water out of it, and use this dry brush to blend. Being very gentle with my pressure when I'm in the area where the petals overlap. And I'm now going to let that petal dry. I'm now going to paint this petal on the bottom left of this flower. I just need to lighten up the pencil marks before proceeding. I'm going to start with that clean water with gentle pressure if I'm going on top of a previous petal. Bringing that water down to the center of the flower. I'm going to tip the paper so you can kind of see where that water is and how it overlaps the other two petals side by side. I'm going to switch to my number 6 round, and I'm going to start with just a little bit of that watered down grayish purple. We have a little bit of shadow just towards this central area of the end of the petal. Now I'm going to rinse my brush, and I'm going to get some of that light permanent rose pink on it And I'm going to continue with this pink on the edges. Using gentle pressure anytime I'm on top of previous layers. Now I'm going to rinse my brush and dry it off. And with my clean dry brush, I'm going to kind of feather that transition between the paint color and the clear water, just so the gradients look a little more natural. Now I'm going to switch to my number 2 round so I can get some petal texture in here. So I'm loading it up with that grayish purple, doing a light tap on my sponge so I don't have too much paint on my brush. And I'm starting at the center of the petal and moving out towards the end. I don't want to press down too hard or my brush won't release the paint color. So I'm just adding some petal texture, and this is optional. And I'm going to let that petal dry. I'm going to hop over to the bottom right flower and paint some of its petals. Now I have a fold on the top edge of this petal here, so I need to be very careful to paint the fold at a separate time from the inside of the petal. So I'm going to be applying water, but I won't extend that water to overlap the fold. I'm going to keep it on just below the fold. So I'm making sure my pencil lines are nice and soft. I don't want any puddles of water, so I'm making sure to soak up any excess water before I add my paint color. But this water does overlap the petal on the right, so if I tip my paper, you can kind of see where the water overlaps, and notice how I did not extend the water above onto that fold. I stayed below that fold. This is such a small shape. I'm using my number 2 round just to make sure I don't accidentally bring my paint color into an area I don't want it. I'm using that watered down gray purple, and I'm applying it to the top edge of the water shape, which is right against the fold area. I'm going to get a small amount of that light pink on my brush, and just along that far left edge I'm going to add just a little subtle pink. I'm going to rinse and dry my brush and use it to kind of feather the gradient between the colors and the water. And I'm going to let that dry. While that's drying, I'm going to move on to the larger petal of this flower. So I'm using a large number 10 round to bring clean water into this petal. This petal does overlap the ones side by side, so I'm using just very gentle feather-like pressure so I don't gouge and lift those previous layers. Probably should have lifted my pencil a little bit, but we'll see how it looks. If there's any areas that are drying a little too quickly, I'll just add a second pass of water so the paper remains damp long enough for me to get my colors in before it dries. I'm going to use my number 6 round. I'm going to get some of that gray purple to use along the top and bottom edge where they overlap. Keeping my pressure gentle and light. I'm going to rinse my brush and remove the paint, and I'm going to get some of that soft pink to use towards the right edge of this petal. I'm now going to rinse the paint out of my brush and dry it off. Using a clean, dry brush, I'm going to blend where the color meets the water. I still have a nice gloss to my petal, so I have the option now to add some petal texture if I wish. I would just switch to my small number 2 round. Make sure to wipe away the excess paint so my petal textured lines don't become too wide. Completely optional. And I'm just going to let that petal dry. I'm just double checking my outside edges so that they're nice and smooth. I'm going to return to the top flower, paint that last petal. So I'm lightening the pencil lines. Going to add my clean water. This petal is being overlapped by the petal above, so the water will go on top. However, this petal is behind the petal in the front, so I need to make sure the water doesn't overlap that forward petal. I need to go around it with my water. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. I'm going to tip the paper so you can kind of see where I put that water. So I overlapped the petal above, but went around the petal in the front. If there's any areas that are drying before you've even had a chance to add some paint, make sure you tap in just a little bit more water so that they are damp enough to get your colors in before drying. I'm going to get some of that soft pink, and I'm going to start with the outside edge. I'm going to have a little bit along the very bottom as well, but I'm slowing down when I'm next to that other petal because I want to go around it. I'm going to use this light pink along the top edge as well. When I am on top of that other petal, I am using very gentle pressure so I don't gouge the layers. If there's any puddling of paint, I dry my brush off on a sponge or paper towel and soak up that excess paint. I'm going to rinse all the paint out of my brush and dry it off. And with this clean, dry brush, I'm going to blend where that paint color meets the clean water. If there's any areas where I feel like there's too much paint, I can just dry my brush off and press down with firm pressure in the areas where I want my brush to lift and pick up some of the color to remove it, and my dry brush will soak it up. Now I'm going to switch to a small number 2 round with that light gray purple, and I'm just going to tap in a little bit of shadow towards the end of this petal, and I'm going to add just a little bit of petal texture. So just a little line work. There are some areas of this petal that are starting to lose their shine, so that means I'm running out of my working time. So I need to just kind of clean up my outside edges so I'm happy with them, and then I need to be done with this first layer. I'm going to return down to this bottom petal here. Make sure my pencil lines are nice and light. Add some water. This petal does overlap the bottom petal. There's quite a bit of shadow in this petal, so I'm going to use that light purple gray, and I'm going to fill in this petal. Once I have that nice gray purple throughout, I'm going to get some of that pink. You know what? I'm going to do the pink and purple lake a little bit darker. I'm just going to tap in some of this color in a few areas. Right now it looks like it doesn't belong, but once I blend with a clean dry brush, it'll look better. So I'm going to rinse the paint out of my brush and dry it off. And now with this clean dry brush, I'm going to blend that transition between the two colors so it looks more natural. All right, so while the petals on their first layer finish drying, because I can't paint this last petal since it's sharing an edge, I'm going to go ahead and begin mixing up some of the colors I plan on using in the stem. So in order to do that, I need to add some more clean water to areas of my paint palette. And I just need a small amount of water, about the size of a dime, nothing crazy. But I am putting water in multiple areas because I have at least 4 or 5 colors I plan on mixing for the stem. So one of the first colors I'll be using is a yellow, and this is going to be a cadmium yellow. If I feel like I have the right value, I just want to dip my brush in the color, drag it across the rim, and I want to test that color out on my paper. Since I know the color will brighten up by about 20% through drying, I need to add more color to get the vibrancy that I want. So I am going to get more paint in my mixture. I'm going to test out my color again, and that's more vibrant, and that's what I want. So now I'm going to continue to use cadmium yellow in this next little water puddle, but this time I'm going to add some sap green so I can make a little bit of a lime green color. So working with cadmium yellow at the moment. Once I feel like I have a good vibrant yellow, I'm going to get some of that sap green. I don't need much of it, so I can get kind of this lime green color, and that's what I want. In this next little puddle of water, I'm going to go with a darker green. So I'm going to add quite a bit of sap green. Once I have the sap green where I want, now I'm going to add just a little tiny bit of pink so it can be more of an olive. If I add too much pink, it's going to go straight to brown. So I need to do tiny little increments until I'm happy with the olive green color. And I think if I need it to be a little darker, I might have to add the smallest amount of Payne's gray. And I'm happy with that. I'm now going to add cadmium yellow yet again, but this time I'm going to add some of the pink to it so I can make more of an orange color. I'm always testing out my values. That is not dark enough, so I need to add more pigment. That's better. It might be a little dark, but honestly, I like the color, so why not? And then lastly, I am going to make a brown. Just so I don't have to add more colors, I'm going to make a brown using that pink and sap green. So if you do 50-50 of the green and pink, you're going to get a brown. That works. And I'm going to pull some of this brown over to a new area of my palette using my number 10 round just to pick some of that color up and move it. And in that second brown, I'm going to add some of that Payne's gray to darken it up. All right. Now this stem has a lot of different colors, and if I don't want them all to just blend into one another, creating just one muddy mess, I have to kind of take it in small chunks, okay? So I'm going to start in the stem area of this top flower. A lot of the colors in this area are of a darker value, so I don't suspect the pencil lines will really show through, but just in case, I'm lightening them up. I'm also going to be using my small number 2 round just to make sure I can see where I'm clearly at. So I'm going to start off with this cadmium yellow. And I'm painting wet on dry because these are such small shapes. So once I kind of get the color in the way I want, I can use a dry brush to soak up the excess paint. I'm going to use more of this cadmium yellow at the base of this stem. I'm now going to use some of that light lime green midway up that stem. And at the very top, I'm going to go with that darker olive green because that part of the stem is in shadow because of the flower. And then on the right edge of the stem, I'm just going to add a little bit of the soft pink just for some variation. Now, if you're finding that a lot of your colors at the top of the stem are kicking back into your previous colors towards the bottom, that just means you're bringing too much paint over into the space. So you're overloading your brush with paint, in other words. So just load your brush with less paint and they won't kick back into one another as much and you'll have more control. So right now things are a little damp yet on this stem, so I can come in and tap with my brush on the damp surface to exaggerate any colors that I might choose. So if I want my lime greens to show up a little more, I can come in and tap a little bit more of those lime greens in. But I want to remove any puddling to avoid blooms. All right, so I need to give that area some space. I can, however, go towards the bottom here and paint some of that stem. So I'm going to start with some of the soft pink. Once I have some of that soft pink in, I'm now going to grab that lighter brown, and towards the bottom, I'm going to add some of that light brown. And notice how I start at one end and I don't go back and really fiddle much. I just kind of continue on up, switching my colors as I need to. And that just helps get a nice smooth transition between the colors and minimizes the chance of getting, unexpected blooms and brush strokes that are not my intention. So as I move up, I'm now going to switch to my lighter pink. And this is just layer one, so don't panic if it's not looking exactly how you want it to look. Just build your layers gradually and be patient with the process. Watercolors take layering. You're not going to get a finished product in just one pass. Okay, so I need to give that area some space. I'm going to rinse my brush really good. I'm now going to just double check that I don't have any dark pencil lines. I'm going to lighten them up if I do. I'm going to return to my cadmium yellow using my number 2 round. And I want to go to the ends of these buds, just add some yellow to them. At the very, very end of the bud, I can add some pink, a darker pink. I can use a clean, dry brush to kind of blend the colors if I feel like I want an easier gradient. But when you're painting wet on dry, you don't exactly have a ton of time to blend your colors, so you have to kind of be decisive. And you got to get out before it starts to dry. So I'm going to give that bud some space, and I'm going to continue with the cadmium yellow on my small number 2 round to add some color to the end of this larger bud that's in the beginning bloom. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. I'm going to give that bud some space, and I'm going to hop down to the stem below the flowers just to slowly start building up some details. Lightening up my pencil lines using my kneaded eraser. I'm getting some of that cadmium yellow on my brush. Going to the end of this bud with my cadmium yellow. If I want, I can get some of that dark pink to add to the very end of that bloom, so it kind of has a similar style as the other bud. Use a clean, dry brush to blend the colors while they're damp. If they're already dry, then just be okay with it. It's okay if your painting looks like a painting. I'm now going to get more of that cadmium yellow and just add them to parts of the leaf. I can just use a little bit of water to kind of blend that bottom edge so it's not so harsh. All right, I have a little bit of water droplets on accident from rinsing my brush, so I just dab those off the paper. And as long as this brown stem is completely dry, we can paint that last little petal there. This petal has a fold in front as well, so we need to be mindful of that. I am going to paint the fold first this time. So I'm going to use that really light pink with my number 2 round. And I'm just painting wet on dry. And at the very bottom of this fold, I'm going to add some of that gray purple. Now I'm going to move on to the fold of this petal on the upper left. I'm using that light pink. And I'm just staying right on the fold, wet on dry. Adding this pink to the bottom edge. And then I'm going to rinse my brush, get the paint out of it. And with this mildly damp brush, I'm just going to add a little bit of water to fill in the rest of that fold. All right, so now we have to mix up a darker orange that can be used in the center of each flower. So initially when we mix up an orange, it comes out really, really vibrant, and it doesn't look real natural. This orange in our flowers is kind of sitting at the base of the flower in shadow. So to make it look more natural, we need to kind of dull that orange with the smallest amount of blue. So I have this orange I mixed up. I'm just going to pull some of it aside on my paint palette using my number 6 round just to move some of that over. So I have a separate orange. And I'm now going to use a light cerulean blue to dull it a little bit. So you can kind of see the difference between the two. This is the one with the blue, this is the one without the blue. So it just kind of dulls it a little bit more. That way it looks like it would be in shadow. Now, since I did not mask any of the little stems in the center of the flower, I'm going to paint right over top. It's going to look goofy until I bring in my white paint later. But for now, I'm painting wet on dry. And I want to kind of imagine that this petal comes behind this petal here, comes behind, and that kind of helps me determine where this color needs to go in the center. Now I'm going to dry my brush off, soak up any excess paint from this area, and then with a clean, damp brush, I'm just going to add a little water to the top edge so I can just bring a little bit of this color up. I don't want to go too far up, so I'm just using clean water at the top to make sure that it blends. Remember, if you have paint in an area you don't want it, dry your brush off completely and use firm pressure by pressing down so your brush soaks up paint out of the areas you don't want it. You can also dab with a dry paper towel to soak up color out of areas you don't want it as well. So I'm going to give that area space, and I'm going to hop down to the bottom left flower using that same dull orange. So I want this left edge of this petal to be fluid and continuous. So I'm making sure to kind of follow that line, and that's going to help me determine where this orange needs to be for the center of the flower. Now I'm going to soak up any of the puddling paint with a dry brush. And now with a damp, clean brush, I'm going to pull a little bit of that color up a little bit into more of the flower. If I feel like I still have a hard edge where the color stops, I re-rinse my brush and dry it off on a sponge or paper towel. So once I feel like that color is blended, I'm going to let that be, and I'm going to now move on to the petal on the bottom right. So I'm going to use that dull orange again. Coming to the center of the flower, creating a little curve, just a real subtle curve. Take a moment to study your reference photo to get familiar with the shapes you're trying to paint, rather than guessing. Sometimes just taking a couple minutes to give your chance to really study the shapes you see will help. All right, so I'm going to soak up any puddling paint using a dry brush. I don't want that excess paint sitting there. Once I've removed that excess paint, now I can rinse the paint out of my brush. Lightly tap my sponge, and with this damp brush, I'm just going to soften that edge towards the little pollen. All right, I need to give the flowers some space to dry. I'm now going to return to working on the stem. These areas, since I painted wet on dry, they're very quick to dry, so I don't have to really worry about that too much. I'm going to get some of that light pink on my brush, painting wet on dry. When you're painting wet on dry, if you feel like your paint is drying too quickly, bring a little bit more paint over using your brush. Allow just some mild puddling of paint while you get your first color established. And then you can soak up that excess puddling before introducing any colors that you want to blend with it. And that will help give you just a little bit more working time. So I'm just working with that soft pink, at least getting a layer down on these three little pieces. I'm now going to soak up that excess puddling of pink paint, and I'm going to get some of that dark olive green on my number 2 round, and I'm going to come towards the bottom of these shapes and add that olive green. And when they come in contact with that soft pink, there's going to be some blending between the two colors. So I can kind of, while things are damp, I can kind of blend these two colors the way I want. I'm going to grab some of that real vibrant orange that I mixed up, add a touch of that here and there before things dry. I'm going to give that area space and move on to this little flower bud. I'm going to start with my lime green, since it's my first color that I'm doing with that wet on dry. I'm going to allow a little bit of puddling just to give me some working time so it doesn't dry before I get the second color in. I'm kind of hugging that left edge with my lime green. I'm going to now soak up some of the puddling of that lime green, and I'm going to grab that dark olive green, wiping away the excess paint before I come to my painting. So if you don't wipe away your excess paint before introducing that second color, your brush will drop too much of that second color and it's going to just completely dominate the entire space because you're going to release too much color into the shape and it's going to push back and dominate the first color that you had. So being mindful of how much paint is on your brush before you bring them over is very helpful. If I want, I can introduce some of that orange. I'm going to do some of it right at the base just for fun. I like having a variety of colors. I'm now going to return to that lime green. Going to the end of my bud. I'm going to bring this lime green all the way down towards the bottom. Now at the bottom, I want there to be a little bit more pinks. So I can just tap in some pinks directly on top of some of that wet lime green. I'm going to add some of that dark olive green midway through this area. I can use a clean, dry brush to kind of blend the colors on the surface of my paper. But once I notice certain areas beginning to dry, I need to just kind of step away and move on to painting a different part. So I'm going to come to the opposite side with my lime green. I'm going to add some dark green midway. And I'm just going to give that area some space. I'm going to come down towards the bottom and start working on that stem there. I'm going to grab a little bit of my cadmium yellow. Coming to the very end of my shape. Rinse my brush. I'm going to get some of that soft pink on my brush. And at the very base of the bud, I'm just going to add a little bit of soft pink. But I want this soft pink to kind of blend in with my lighter brown. So while that pink is wet, I'm going to grab some of my lighter brown and add some of this color to the stem. If your brush is kind of skipping the texture of the paper and isn't giving you a full coverage of color, that means you don't have enough paint on your brush. So really let your brush soak up paint if you're painting wet on dry and you have a larger space to cover. So I've added some of my brown to the bottom half of this stem. And now I'm going to be getting some of my light pink to add to the top half. I'm going to avoid going down into parts of the stem that are already beginning to dry. It's okay to have some texture on your stem. Don't panic if you have brush strokes and blooms. All right, I need to give that area down below some space to dry. So now I'm going to take a look at my petals and I'm going to determine if I need to darken up the shadows or silhouettes that are created by the overlapping petals, okay? So if I don't have this defined shape here, and everybody's painting is going to be a little different, you might want to add a soft glaze of color just to make that pop a little bit more. So for example, when I say glaze, I'm talking about a really watered down version of your color, kind of like the consistency of tea, okay? We don't need anything dark. So if I want to make this overlapped silhouette between the two petals pop a little bit more, I can come in with the glaze, wet on dry, using that really soft pink, and I can just do a little glaze to really just make it pop forward. I have the optional choice of doing this in between each petal. So if you want that contrast and you want it to really pop forward, then you can take a moment to do this. Just take your time and keep in mind this is completely optional. If you like the way your flowers are already looking as is, you can skip ahead to the next step. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. Once you have the overlapping shadows where you want them as far as value, now we can shift our concentration to painting some of the shadows that we're missing. So for example, on the front portion of this petal, I have just the tiniest fold. So I'm going to use that light pink to establish the front fold on this petal. It's very narrow Doesn't have to be anything large or wide. Just painting wet on dry. The other thing I want to be aware of is there is a shadow from all of the pollen being cast on this forward petal here. So I'm going to be using that light watered down grayish purple, and I'm going to possibly dilute the color even further by adding additional water so it's a nice soft color. I don't want the shadow to be the first thing that people look at in this painting. So I'm choosing to just have a nice soft watered down color. I'm painting wet on dry. And the first thing I want to do is I want to kind of create this circular shape. It doesn't have to be perfect circle. Shadows are often uneven and irregular in shape. So try to avoid smoothing everything out. And then once I have that kind of irregular shape, then I can paint some thin lines and stems as the illusion of shadow for some of the pollen. If you feel like any parts of your shadow are a little too intense, you can always dab with a dry paper towel just to soften them so they're a little more subtle. I can do this same technique for any shadows elsewhere that I might need them. So I just want to use that real watered down gray purple so it's the consistency of tea. And I want to find the areas where I want more shadow. So for example, this petal on the right side, I have quite a bit more shadow. So I can just come in with my number 6 round and a glaze over this right edge. The key to glazing though is you have to be decisive. Get your shadow in and get out. Don't spend a ton of time because it is going to want to dry since we're painting them wet on dry. So I really make sure to load my brush with quite a bit of the shadow color, making sure it's usually lighter than I think I need it, because nothing's worse than having your shadows be a little too dark on accident. And I allow myself to really bring in kind of a puddle of that shadow color in the beginning, and if I need to, I can soak up the excess paint when I'm happy with the shape for my shadow. So I'm coming to the end of this petal here. Again, my brush is overloaded with paint, so it's holding quite a bit in it. That way I can get this shadow in before it begins to dry. If there's ever shadows that you feel like, oh, that might be too intense, just do a light tap with your dry paper towel to soften it up so it's not so dark. And give your eyes time to really study the shapes that the shadows are creating. Don't just go in blindly. Ask yourself, how narrow is that shape? Is it a curved line or a flat line? And once I'm done with the shadow, I soak up the excess paint just so it doesn't dry with such a built-up pigment edge. And I just want to remind you how light my shadow is. Okay, you can barely see the tint of color when I test it out on a scrap piece of paper. So really water down your shadow color. A lot of times when I'm doing shadows, I'm often following the contour of the petal, so it lends itself to my subject. And I use a dry brush to soak up the excess paint. So I'm just taking a moment to study my reference photo to see if there's any additional shadows that I wish to add. And there are a few subtle ones. So like these petals have really no texture in the petals or folds. So I feel like I need to add just a little bit, even if they are subtle and few. That way they just don't look completely forgotten about. This large petal to the right on this bottom right flower, they are also lacking in texture and detail, so I'm going to use a really watered down version of that purple gray just to get some subtle texture into these petals so they don't look forgotten about. It doesn't have to be a lot. It can simply be a couple strokes and then all of a sudden that petal looks like it is finished. I'm also going to add just a little bit of shadow to this forward petal here. Soaking up any puddling paint. All right, I want to give the petals a break, so I'm going to proceed with working on the stem and buds. I'm going to go to this bud on the end here. I'm going to start with my light lime green. And with the first color, I am allowing that puddling so it doesn't dry too fast. So I'm bringing in quite a bit of paint and letting it kind of sit in a thick puddle. As I get closer to the base of this bud, I'm going to rinse my brush and grab some light pink. I'm now going to rinse my brush and grab some of that dark olive green so I can add some of that dark green midway. I'm going to add more of this dark olive green to the outside edge. I'm going to give that bud some space. I'm going to come down towards the bottom here. I'm going to start with that lime green. Being kind of heavy-handed with the amount of paint I'm adding to my paper. As I get down towards the bottom, I'm going to be switching to more of my dark olive green. If it comes in contact with that lime green, they're going to have some blending, and I'm okay with that. I'm going to continue to use some of this lime green on this far little bud that's on the opposite side of the branch. I can grab some of that dark green and just tap some of that in at the base. I can get the paint out of my brush by dragging it on a sponge, and I can just blend the colors right on the surface there while they're both wet, soaking up any excess paint just to give myself more control. I'm going to get more of that light brown. Okay, so there's a few little stems that I want to add before I add the final whites and remove my masking fluid. So on the front side, the stems that lead to the little pollen heads are actually brighter in color against its background. So that's where I'm going to be adding some whites. However, the stems that are leading to the little pollen clusters towards the back, they are actually darker in color up against the brightness of the petals. So I'm going to be using just a real subtle kind of pink, gray, purple color to create those stems towards the back. So I'm going to show you what that color looks like. That's probably too light because I do want it to stand out a bit. So I'm going to add some more pink. So this is just a combination of that pink and gray purple color. So it's very similar to our shadow color. Once I get to painting, if it doesn't give me enough contrast from the petal that it's on, then I might have to go a little darker. But I'm going to start here at the top flower. I'm just going to find some of the rear pollen areas and just create some thin stems that angle down towards the center of the flower. And as long as I can see them and there's good contrast, then I don't feel like I need to go any darker. But this is kind of one of those steps that everybody will have to individually adjust based on their painting's colors and values. So I can see some of mine and some of them I can't. So some I might have to go a little darker or do a second or third pass. Because it does lighten up when it dries. So take a moment to just kind of observe what the color ends up being after it dries. And if you can't clearly see them, then you might need to do a second pass. But once you're happy with the value, then move on to the next flower and do the same. At this point, I'm just using my purple gray without watering it down because my first value just wasn't dark enough. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. I'm just taking a moment to pause and look at the values of these thin stems before I consider removing the masking fluid. I want to make sure that they are the right value before I remove. All right, I'm going to give those areas some time to dry. I'm going to return to my stem and start pushing some of the values here and adding some texture. I'm going to get some of my dark olive green. Just trying to add some leaf-like texture. To the front of this bud, just to add some interest. I can rinse my brush and use a mildly damp brush with water to kind of blend the bottom edge of this wet paint. This is where I really enjoy pushing the contrast and details in my paintings. So I'm just laying down some color, rinsing my brush, and then with a clean, barely damp brush, I'm just kind of blending the edge of that color on this dry surface. Takes a little bit of practice, but once you figure out your water ratio, it becomes a lot easier. Adding some dark olive green to the bottom of this bud. I'm then going to switch to a light pink where it connects to the branch, because why not? So now, right now, our branch is looking kind of flat. We have a lot of wonderful color and variations of values, but we don't really have any texture. So this is where I'm going to start layering my colors on top. So I'm going to get this lighter brown and I'm going to start adding texture by just kind of created these curved dotted lines that kind of hug the shape and contour of my branch. So I'm kind of starting from the bottom edge and curving up towards the top, and you'll notice that my lines are not straight. They have just this ever so subtle contour to them as if they're wrapping around that branch. And my lines are not perfect and consistent. I'm kind of doing them, some dashed, some are dotted. I just want to add some texture so that this branch doesn't look like this second forgotten about component. They are equally as important as the rest of the subject. So I can kind of create this little subtle curve around the base of where some of the new blossoms are coming out. Just try not to hit the flower in the foreground as you do it. I do want to darken up some parts of the buds using that orange. Just to give a little bit more contrast. If there's any puddling paint, I can soak that up. Just adding a couple dark little textures at the ends of some of the buds. So now I'm going to use the darker brown that I added some Payne's gray to, just to push the contrast still some more. So I'm going to come in towards the bottom of the stem and continue to add some texture detail following the contour of the branch. And I'm really just trying to kind of give it a bit of a rough texture. I just want to add some interest to this branch. Okay, I'm happy with the branch and where those buds are at. I'm now going to remove the masking fluid from the little pollen. You can use just clean fingertips and firm pressure to remove the masking fluid. Sometimes I find that there might be little flecks of masking fluid that are stubborn and don't want to come up. So I often use a rubber cement pickup. It just helps give me peace of mind that I have removed all of the masking fluid confidently. Be very mindful of your dark Payne's gray. Don't smear them with your hand. That would be an unfortunate accident. It would be easy to smear it if you are brushing the masking fluid flakes away and you go towards your wet paint. I've done it before. Okay, so now that the masking fluid is off, I'm going to use that brighter orange that I mixed up for the pollen. And you could use, a cadmium yellow for this if you would prefer. I just really like this orange color, so I'm just going for it. Yellow might stand out a little better against some of the darker colors of the flower. So pick whichever color you feel comfortable with. If there's little puddles of paint, I just use a dry brush to kind of soak up that excess. I think for the center larger pollen, I'm going to use the cadmium yellow just to add some variety. Soak up the little puddles to make it dry faster. If any color looks a little too dark and is camouflaging in with the background values, you can just do a light dab with your paper towel to soften it up a little bit. Just lightening up some of my colors by dabbing the dry paper towel. Soaking up any of the puddling just so it dries nice and even and more quickly. It's kind of the tedious part of the painting, but I'd consider it's one of the easier steps. Soaking up the petals, tapping with a dry paper towel just to lighten it up a bit. Now I'm going to use that cadmium yellow because I'm personally choosing to just put cadmium yellow in the very center. Everybody's centers can look a little different. Doesn't matter as long as you're learning. All right, so this is where the bright white in the foreground comes into play. You can use, white gouache, a good brand of white gouache that is very opaque, or you can use this bleed-proof white. Doesn't really matter. But the key is you want narrow lines. So you can't go in with a really thick gobbed up brush, okay? So you have to kind of load your brush in a way where you can twirl your brush, get rid of that thick excess paint, and thin it out so that your brush comes to a nice narrow point. I will tap my sponge just to remove some of that excess paint, just to ensure I can get a narrow line. So now I'm going to come into the foreground and I'm just adding some of these stems now. Very light pressure. Rather than tracing a stem in attempts to fix little imperfections, I'm allowing those little imperfections be, because the more we kind of fiddle and try and perfect our stems, the wider they actually become. It's not helpful. So I much rather just be okay with the imperfections and the little wobbles and just let them be so that they don't just keep getting larger and larger. So with those little bits of white in the foreground, it just kind of is the finishing touch on our cherry blossoms. All right, so that's our cherry blossoms for today. If you liked the video, please let me know. Leave a comment, hit that thumbs up button, and if you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe because I'll release another video next week. Happy painting!